You believe mental hospitals were built to heal the broken minds of society, don't you? Of course you do. That's what they taught you in school, what you've seen in movies, what comfortable history books whisper in sanitized chapters. But tonight, while you scroll through your phone in the safety of your modern world, I'm going to show you what really happened behind the iron gates and barred windows of Victorian asylums. And when I'm done, you'll never look at a hospital corridor the same way again. Picture this. London, 1845. The fog rolls thick through cobblestone streets, but there's something else choking the air around Bethlem Royal Hospital, something that makes your throat close and your skin crawl. It's not just the Thames River stench or coal smoke. It's the weight of screams that have soaked into brick and mortar for over 4 centuries. Screams that echo still if you know how to listen. They called it bedlam, a word that became synonymous with chaos, madness, absolute bedlam. But here's what they didn't tell you in those neat little history lessons. Bedlam wasn't just a hospital. It was London's most popular tourist attraction. Every Sunday, for the price of a penny, families would pack picnic baskets and stroll through the corridors like it was a zoo. A human zoo where the caged animals were your neighbors, your relatives, people whose only crime was being different in a world that demanded conformity. Can you imagine it? The sound of your laughter mixing with the moans of people chained to walls, the smell of your Sunday roast competing with the stench of human waste and rotting flesh. Children pointing and giggling at women who'd been locked away for the audacity of reading too many books, or men whose minds had cracked under the pressure of war. This wasn't medicine. This was entertainment, and you paid for front row seats to watch humanity at its most vulnerable being paraded like circus freaks. But the Sunday spectacles were just the tip of an iceberg that goes deeper than you can imagine. Let me take you inside those walls, past the ticket booth, past the gift shop where they sold little trinkets made by the patients, into the real heart of Victorian psychiatric care. Are you ready to see what healing looked like when morality wore a mask? The smell hits you first. It always does. Urine, vomit, and something else. Something metallic that clings to the back of your throat. That's the smell of fear, of blood, of hope, dying slowly in rooms where sunlight never reaches. The corridors stretch endlessly, lined with doors that look more like portals to hell than entrances to healing spaces. Behind each one, a story that would make your modern sensibilities recoil in horror. Take cell 47, for instance. That's where they kept Martha Simmons, a 34-year-old seamstress whose crime was crying too much after her husband died in a factory accident. The treatment? Complete sensory deprivation. They wrapped her in wet sheets, tighter than a mummy's bindings, and left her in absolute darkness for weeks. The wet cloth would shrink as it dried, constricting around her body like a python slowly crushing its prey. They called it the pack treatment. We'd call it torture. But Martha was lucky compared to the patients in the hydrotherapy wing. Picture this. A woman strapped to a chair, her head locked in position, while gallons of ice-cold water crashed down from 10 feet above. The force alone could fracture skulls, but that wasn't the point. The point was to shock the madness out through sheer, overwhelming sensation. Some patients would scream until their vocal cords snapped. Others would pass out from the trauma, only to be revived and subjected to the treatment again and again and again. Dr. Henry Maudsley, one of the most respected psychiatrists of the era, wrote extensively about these methods. His journals, preserved in the Royal College of Physicians, describe patients with clinical detachment that would make a mortician blush. Patient exhibits excessive emotional responses to minor stimuli. He noted about a young man whose only symptom was crying when his sister visited. The cure? Isolation so complete that guards were forbidden from speaking to him. He died after 3 months, not from madness, but from what we now know was severe dehydration and malnutrition. His treatment? Officially listed as successful. The madness was gone, after all. You're probably thinking this was just Bedlam, just one rogue institution. But let me shatter that comfortable delusion. Every major city in England had its asylum. Colney Hatch in North London could house 2,500 patients at a time. The West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum specialized in what they called mechanical restraints. Hanwell Asylum pioneered the non-restraint movement, which sounds progressive until you realize that their alternative to chains was something far more sinister. At Hanwell, they discovered that the human mind could be broken more efficiently through psychological manipulation than physical restraint. Dr. John Connolly, the superintendent, developed a system of rewards and punishments so subtle, so pervasive, that patients would police themselves. Speak out of turn, no food for 3 days, show emotion during visiting hours, solitary confinement, express any desire to leave. Well, that was proof positive that you weren't ready to rejoin society. The genius of Connolly's system wasn't in its cruelty, but in its efficiency. Patients learned to suppress every natural human response until they became living mannequins, empty shells that posed no threat to Victorian society's rigid expectation. They were released not because they were healed, but because they had been successfully hollowed out. And society celebrated this as progress, but here's where the story takes a turn that will freeze your blood. These weren't random acts of individual sadism. This was systematic, scientific, and backed by the most brilliant medical minds of the age. The Victorian-Era was the height of human progress, after all. Steam engines, electricity, modern medicine. Surely these doctors knew what they were doing. They did. They knew exactly what they were doing. The truth is buried in dusty medical journals and forgotten government reports, but it's there if you dig deep enough. The Victorian asylum system wasn't designed to heal mental illness. It was designed to remove social inconvenience. Women who spoke too loudly, men who drank too much, children who couldn't sit still, elderly people whose families found them burdensome. Anyone who disrupted the perfect facade of respectable society could be declared insane and disappeared behind asylum walls. The criteria for admission were so broad, so subjective, that anyone could find themselves there. Moral insanity was a legitimate diagnosis. So was masturbatory insanity, religious excitement, and my personal favorite, novel reading. Yes, you could be locked away for reading too many books. In a society that prided itself on literature and learning, imagination became a dangerous liability. Doctor? Isaac Ray, one of the founding fathers of American psychiatry, but deeply influenced by British methods, wrote in his medical texts that women were particularly susceptible to madness because of their weaker constitution and emotional nature. A woman who refused marriage, pursued education, or expressed political opinions was showing clear signs of mental instability. The cure? Forced domesticity, administered in the controlled environment of an asylum until she learned to properly submit to societal expectations. The patient records make for horrifying reading. Sarah Mitchell, age 19, admitted for excessive reading and unwillingness to accept suitors. Treatment included forced manual labor, restricted diet, and what they euphemistically called moral treatment, which involved constant lectures about a woman's proper place in society. Margaret Thompson, age 45, committed by her husband for disagreeable disposition and refusal to maintain household duties. She spent 7 years in restraints before dying of what the records list as exhaustion. These weren't isolated cases, they were the norm. The archives of British asylums from 1845 to 1895 show that nearly 60% of female patients were committed for behaviors that today we'd consider perfectly normal expressions of personality or independence. The asylum system wasn't just treating mental illness, it was enforcing social control with surgical precision. And the men, they had their own special category of horrors. Shell shock from the Crimean War was treated as cowardice. Depression following industrial accidents was seen as weakness of character. Workers who organized for better conditions were diagnosed with revolutionary insanity, a condition that could only be cured through intensive labor therapy and political re-education. The treatment records are filled with innovations that make medieval torture look humane by comparison. The rotating chair, invented by Dr. Benjamin Rush and perfected in British asylums, spun patients at high speeds until they vomited blood and lost consciousness. The theory was that centrifugal force would reorganize their disordered thoughts. In practice, it caused brain hemorrhages and permanent neurological damage. Then there was trepanation, the practice of drilling holes in patients' skulls to release evil spirits or relieve pressure on the brain. Victorian doctors had refined this ancient practice into an art form, using precise measurements and anatomical charts to determine exactly where to bore into a living human head. No anesthesia, of course. The screaming was considered part of the therapeutic process. But perhaps the most chilling innovation was the development of surgical procedures designed specifically to make patients more manageable. Dr. Gottlieb Burckhardt, working closely with British colleagues, pioneered what we now call lobotomy decades before it became famous in America. He would cut into patients' brains through small incisions, severing connections that he believed caused aggressive or uncooperative behavior. His success rate, according to his own records, was remarkable. Patients who had been violent or resistant became docile and compliant almost immediately. What his records don't mention is that these patients also became unable to form new memories, lost the ability to experience emotions, and often died within months from infections or complications. But they were no longer disruptive, so the treatment was considered a triumph. The truly horrifying part isn't just what they did to their patients. It's how they convinced themselves and society that they were heroes. These doctors genuinely believed they were advancing human knowledge, pushing the boundaries of medical science for the betterment of mankind. They published papers, gave lectures, received honors and accolades for their work. Dr. Henry Maudsley had a hospital named after him. Dr. John Connolly has statues erected in his honor. They weren't monsters hiding in the shadows. They were respected members of society, invited to the finest dinner parties, welcomed in the most exclusive social circles. Their wives threw tea parties to raise funds for asylum expansion. Their children grew up proud of Daddy's important work helping the less fortunate. The entire Victorian establishment not only tolerated but celebrated the systematic brutalization of vulnerable human beings. And here's the part that should keep you awake tonight. It worked. The asylum system achieved exactly what it was designed to do. Social dissent was minimized, family disruptions were eliminated, and society's image of itself as civilized and progressive remained intact. The price was paid by people whose voices had been systematically silenced, whose stories were buried in institutional records that wouldn't be opened for another century. But this story didn't die in Victorian England. The next time you see a homeless person talking to themselves on the street corner, remember Dr. Maudsley's clinical observations. When you hear someone dismissed as crazy for having opinions that make others uncomfortable, think about Sarah Mitchell and her dangerous books. When you see news reports about overcrowded psychiatric facilities and substandard care, know that you're looking at the direct descendants of Bedlam's Sunday entertainment. We like to think we've progressed, that we've learned from the mistakes of the past. But have we really? Or have we just gotten better at hiding the screams behind more respectable facades? The Victorian asylum system didn't disappear. It evolved, adapted, found new ways to remove inconvenient people from polite society's view. And somewhere, in ways we haven't yet recognized, it's still operating today. You think you've seen the worst of what Victorian medicine could do to the human mind, don't you? That story about the rotating chairs and ice water baths was disturbing enough to satisfy your appetite for historical horror, but you're wrong. Dead wrong. What I showed you was just the appetizer, the gentle introduction to a feast of systematic cruelty that would make the Spanish Inquisition look like a children's tea party. Tonight, I'm taking you deeper into the abyss, into the treatment rooms where Victorian doctors didn't just break minds, they redesigned them. Let me tell you about the Utica crib. Picture a wooden box, barely large enough to hold a human body, with slats so narrow that light filters through in thin, suffocating strips. Now imagine being locked inside it, unable to sit up, unable to stretch, your knees pressed against your chest for hours, days, sometimes weeks at a time. The official medical term was therapeutic confinement. The patients called it the coffin for the living. Dr. Amariah Brigham, superintendent of the Utica State Hospital, invented this masterpiece of medical innovation in 1842. His theory was elegant in its simplicity. If you could completely restrict a patient's physical movement, their mental agitation would naturally subside. What he discovered instead was that the human psyche, when compressed beyond its limits, doesn't calm down. It fractures, shatters into pieces so small they can never be reassembled. Patient records from Utica reveal the true genius of Brigham's invention. Mary O'Sullivan, a 28-year-old Irish immigrant committed for melancholic tendencies, spent 72 consecutive hours in the crib. When they finally opened it, she had torn off her fingernails clawing at the wood. Her voice was gone from screaming, but here's the truly horrifying part. She never spoke again. Not a word. For the remaining 14 years of her life in the asylum, Mary O'Sullivan existed in perfect, absolute silence. The treatment had worked. Her melancholy was cured, but Brigham wasn't satisfied with simple physical restraint. He wanted to understand the mechanics of madness, to map the geography of insanity with scientific precision. So he began experimenting with what he called a cerebral manipulation. Using instruments borrowed from veterinary surgery, he would expose patients' brains through carefully measured incisions, then apply direct pressure to different areas while observing behavioral changes. His notes, preserved in the archives of the American Journal of Insanity, read like a mechanic's manual for the human soul. Pressure applied to the frontal lobe results in immediate cessation of verbal outbursts, he wrote about Timothy Walsh, a farmer who'd been committed for public drunkenness. Subject remains conscious and responsive, but no longer exhibits disruptive tendencies. What Brigham didn't mention was that Timothy could no longer recognize his own children when they visited. The part of his brain responsible for forming emotional attachments had been systematically destroyed. While Brigham was pioneering brain surgery, his British colleagues were exploring the therapeutic potential of pharmaceutical intervention. Dr. Alexander Morrison at Bethlehem had discovered that certain combinations of mercury, opium, and arsenic could produce remarkable changes in patient behavior. Not healing, mind you, changes. The mercury ate through patients' nervous systems like acid through metal, leaving them with tremors and speech impediments that made communication impossible. The opium created a dreamy compliance that doctors mistook for contentment. The arsenic slowly poisoned their organs while producing a pale, ethereal complexion that Victorian society associated with refined sensibility. Patients who had been committed for violent outbursts became docile, soft-spoken, and tragically beautiful in their slow-motion dying. Morrison called it the angel treatment because patients would develop an otherworldly serenity as the chemicals systematically shut down their bodily function. Their families would visit and marvel at how peaceful, how angelic their loved ones had become. What they were really seeing was the careful orchestration of human decay, poisoning disguised as psychiatric progress. The truly diabolical part was how these treatments were marketed to Victorian society. Families weren't told their relatives were being experimented on. They were told about revolutionary new therapies, breakthrough treatments that represented the pinnacle of modern medical science. Glossy brochures featured testimonials from grateful families whose difficult relatives had been transformed into manageable, pleasant companions. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell wrote to the London Times in 1851, praising Dr. Morrison's work. My dear Sister Catherine, who had been afflicted with the most dreadful fits of hysteria, has been completely cured through the angel treatment. She is now the most gentle, agreeable creature, though she does require constant care due to her delicate constitution. And what Mrs. Hartwell didn't know was that Catherine's delicate constitution was mercury poisoning, and her gentle demeanor was the result of brain damage so severe she could no longer form coherent thoughts. But the chemical treatments were just one branch of Victorian psychiatric innovation. Dr. David Skay at the Royal Edinburgh Asylum had developed what he called climatological therapy, based on his theory that madness was influenced by atmospheric pressure and environmental conditions. His solution was to create artificial weather systems inside the asylum, subjecting patients to rapid changes in temperature, humidity, and air pressure that would supposedly realign their disturbed mental states. The treatment rooms at Edinburgh were marvels of Victorian engineering. Steam pipes could raise the temperature to over 120 degrees Fahrenheit while maintaining near zero humidity, essentially turning human beings into jerky. Refrigeration systems could drop to temperatures below freezing while pumping in moisture-saturated air that would form ice crystals in patients' lungs. Pneumatic chambers could simulate the air pressure found at altitudes of 15,000 feet, causing hypoxia and hallucinations that doctors interpreted as breakthrough moments in treatment. Patient records show that Skay's climatological treatments had a 100% success rate in eliminating behavioral problems. Of course, they also had a 73% mortality rate within 6 months, but that was considered an acceptable trade-off for social peace. Those who survived were so physically damaged by the extreme conditions that they required constant medical care, making them perfect long-term residents who posed no threat to respectable society. The genius of Skay's system wasn't just in its effectiveness, but in its philosophical foundation. He had managed to medicalize the very concept of environmental adaptation, turning the human body's natural responses to extreme conditions into symptoms of mental illness that required further treatment. Patients who shivered in the cold were exhibiting thermal dysfunction. Those who sweated in extreme heat were displaying thermoregulatory madness. Every natural human response became evidence of psychiatric pathology. Meanwhile, across the Channel in France, Dr. Jules Bayarger was pioneering what he called sensory rehabilitation therapy. His theory was that madness resulted from the brain's inability to properly process sensory information, so the cure lay in overwhelming the senses until they reset themselves like a mechanical device that had been wound too tightly. Bayarger's treatment rooms were designed to assault every sense simultaneously. Patients would be strapped to chairs and chambers filled with strobing lights that flickered at frequencies known to trigger seizures. Speakers would blast discordant sounds at volumes that could rupture eardrums. The air would be saturated with combinations of perfumes, spices, and chemical odors so intense they would cause nausea and disorientation. Patients' mouths would be filled with mixtures of salt, sugar, quinine, and acids that would create taste sensations so extreme they could cause permanent damage to taste buds and salivary glands. The theory was that this sensory overload would force the brain to shut down its faulty processing systems and rebuild them from scratch. In practice, it caused what we now know as sensory processing disorder, leaving patients unable to distinguish between different types of stimulation. They would react to gentle touches, as if they were being burned, or fail to respond to actual pain because their nervous systems could no longer differentiate between sensations. But Bayarger considered this a breakthrough. Patients who had been committed for emotional outbursts would sit quietly in their cells, staring at nothing, responding to no one. Their minds had retreated so far from external stimulation that they existed in a kind of waking coma. To Victorian observers, this looked like the perfect cure for madness. The patients were calm, manageable, and completely harmless. Dr. Wilhelm Griesinger in Berlin took a different approach entirely. He believed that madness was caused by moral corruption, and that the cure lay in what he called ethical restructuring. His patients underwent intensive programs designed to systematically destroy their existing personality structures and rebuild them according to proper Victorian moral principles. The process began with what Griesinger called confession therapy. Patients would be isolated in soundproof chambers and subjected to continuous interrogation about their moral failings, their secret thoughts, their hidden desires. The sessions would continue for hours, sometimes days, with teams of doctors taking turns to maintain constant pressure. Patients were denied food, water, or sleep until they confessed to sins they may never have committed. Once the confession phase was complete, patients entered moral reconstruction. They would be forced to memorize vast quantities of religious texts, moral philosophy, and social etiquette. Any deviation from perfect recitation would result in physical punishment. Patients learned to suppress every spontaneous thought or emotion, replacing them with approved responses that had been drilled into them through repetition and fear. The final phase was social reintegration, where patients would practice interactions with carefully scripted scenarios designed to test their moral reformation. They would be presented with situations that might trigger their previous problematic behaviors, and their responses would be evaluated for proper Victorian sensibility. Only when they had demonstrated complete suppression of their original personality could they be considered cured. Griesinger's success rate was remarkable. Patients who completed his program showed no signs of their original psychiatric symptoms. They were polite, deferential, and completely predictable in their responses to any social situation. They had been transformed from complex, troubled human beings into Victorian automaton, programmed to respond appropriately to any circumstance without exhibiting dangerous signs of individual thought or emotion. The truly chilling aspect of these treatments wasn't their cruelty, though they were undoubtedly cruel beyond measure. It was their systematic nature, the way they reduced human suffering to a series of technical problems that could be solved through proper application of scientific method. These doctors weren't sadists, they were engineers, approaching the human psyche like any other machine that needed repair or improvement. They published their results in prestigious medical journals, presented their findings at international conferences, and trained the next generation of psychiatric professionals in their methods. Their work was celebrated as the dawn of modern mental health care, the triumph of scientific rationality over superstition and ignorance. But here's what should really terrify you about this story. It never really ended. The names changed, the technology improved, the justifications became more sophisticated, but the fundamental premise remained the same. Society had identified certain types of people as problems to be solved, and medicine had provided the tools to solve them. When you see news stories about experimental psychiatric treatments, remember Dr. Brigham's surgical precision. When you hear about pharmaceutical interventions that promise to eliminate disruptive behaviors, think about Dr. Morrison's angel treatment. When you read about therapeutic programs designed to modify personality disorders, consider Dr. Griesinger's moral reconstruction. The Victorian Asylum may be gone, but its spirit lives on in every institution that promises to fix what society deems broken about the human condition. You think social hierarchies are brutal in your modern world, don't you? Your office politics, your school cliques, your neighborhood pecking orders that determine who gets invited to dinner parties and who gets ignored at the grocery store. But those are playground games compared to what I'm about to show you. Inside Victorian asylums, they didn't just create social hierarchies, they weaponized them, turning human desperation into a perfectly orchestrated system of control that would make totalitarian regimes weep with envy. Let me take you to Ward 7 of the Surrey County Asylum in 1863, where Dr. Proust Charles Bucknell had perfected what he called the classification treatment system. Fully, imagine walking into a building where every person has been sorted, labeled, and assigned a social value based not on their humanity, but on their usefulness to the institution. This wasn't just medical care, it was human taxonomy, and the categories would chill your blood. At the top of the hierarchy were the curables, patients whose families could afford premium treatment and whose conditions were deemed temporary inconveniences rather than permanent moral failings. These were typically wealthy men suffering from what we'd now recognize as depression following business failures, or upper-class women experiencing postpartum difficulties. They lived in private rooms with actual windows, ate meals prepared by kitchen staff, and received daily visits from doctors who spoke to them like human beings. Below them were the improvables, middle-class patients whose families could afford standard fees but whose conditions were considered more challenging. They lived in shared dormitories, ate institutional food, and saw doctors twice weekly for what passed as therapeutic conversation. But here's where the system revealed its true cruelty. Improvables could be promoted to curable status by demonstrating proper social behavior, or demoted to lower categories for infractions as minor as laughing too loudly or asking too many questions. The middle tier consisted of quiets, patients who had been successfully broken by the system and no longer posed any administrative challenges. These were people who had learned that survival meant absolute compliance, who had trained themselves to become invisible, to never speak unless spoken to anticipate the needs of staff before those needs were expressed. Quiets were rewarded with slightly better food, occasional supervised walks in the courtyard, and the privilege of performing menial labor that kept the asylum functioning. But it was the bottom three categories where the true horror of Victorian psychiatric classification revealed itself. Troublesomes were patients who still retained enough spirit to resist their treatment, who asked questions about their diagnosis, who demanded to see family members or legal representation. These patients lived in cells with no furniture except straw on the floor, were fed a diet designed to induce weakness and compliance, and were subjected to constant surveillance by guards who were instructed to report every word, every gesture, every facial expression. Below the troublesomes were the incurables, patients whose conditions were deemed permanent and whose families had either stopped paying for their care or never had money to begin with. These were the asylum's livestock, kept alive to justify government funding, but given no treatment beyond basic subsistence. They lived 20 to a room, slept on floors covered with sawdust that was changed monthly if they were lucky, and were fed scraps that would have been rejected by workhouse dogs. At the very bottom of this pyramid of human degradation were the violents, patients who had been so damaged by their treatment that they had become genuinely dangerous to themselves and others. These weren't people who had arrived at the asylum violent. They were people whom the asylum had systematically tortured until violence became their only remaining form of communication. They were kept in underground chambers, chained to walls, and fed through slots and iron doors like wild animals in medieval dungeons. The genius of Bucknell's system wasn't just in its cruelty, but in how it turned patients against each other. Quiets could earn privileges by reporting on troublesome. Improvables could avoid demotion by demonstrating their superiority to lower categories. Even within each category, there were sub-rankings that could be improved through proper behavior or lost through infractions. The asylum had created a society where survival depended not on healing, but on becoming the most perfect victim possible. Dr. John Thurnham at the Wiltshire County Asylum took this classification system even further, introducing what he called moral categories that went beyond medical diagnosis to evaluate patients' character, background, and social value. His categories included hereditary degenerates, patients whose families showed any history of mental illness, alcoholism, or poverty. These patients were considered genetically inferior and were automatically sterilized upon admission to prevent them from corrupting future generations. Foreign contaminants were immigrants, particularly Irish Catholics and Eastern European Jews, who were considered racially predisposed to madness and moral corruption. Thurnham's treatment protocols for these patients focused not on healing their minds, but on anglicizing their behavior through forced cultural assimilation. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages, practicing their religions, or maintaining any connections to their ethnic communities. Moral defectives were patients whose madness was attributed to personal vice rather than medical causes. This included anyone who had been arrested for public drunkenness, women who had given birth outside marriage, men who had been caught in homosexual activities, and anyone whose family had requested commitment for behavioral problems. These patients were subjected to intensive moral rehabilitation that combined religious indoctrination with physical punishment, designed to associate sinful thoughts with immediate pain. But perhaps the most sinister category was social experiments. Patients who were selected not because of their mental condition, but because their social status made them ideal subjects for testing new treatments. Orphans, elderly people without families, immigrants without local connection, and anyone whose disappearance wouldn't be noticed or investigated became human laboratory rats for whatever medical innovation doctors wanted to explore. The treatment records for social experiments make for horrifying reading. Patient SE47 was a 16-year-old Irish orphan girl who had been committed for inappropriate emotional responses after crying when separated from her younger brother at the workhouse. She became the subject of Dr. Thurnham's experiments with electrical stimulation of brain tissue. Over a period of 18 months, she was subjected to increasingly powerful electrical shocks applied directly to her exposed brain through holes drilled in her skull. The goal was to identify which areas of the brain controlled emotional expression, and the method was to systematically destroy different regions while observing changes in behavior. SE47's responses were meticulously documented. At first, she would scream and beg for the treatments to stop. Then she began crying silently during the procedures. Then she stopped reacting entirely. By the end of the experiment, she could feel the electrical probes burning through her brain tissue without showing any response at all. Thurnham considered this a breakthrough in understanding the neurology of emotion. His published papers described how he had successfully isolated and neutralized the brain centers responsible for excessive emotional display. What he had actually done was torture a child until her capacity for feeling had been completely destroyed. She lived for 3 more years after the experiments ended, sitting motionless in her cell, staring at nothing, until she died of what the records list as organic failure. She was 19 years old. The classification system created its own internal economy, with privileges and punishments that could be traded, earned, or lost, based on a complex set of rules that changed according to staff whims and institutional needs. Patients learned to navigate this system with the desperation of people whose lives depended on their ability to read the moods and desires of their captors. Mary Hutchinson, a middle-class woman committed for melancholic episodes following the death of her infant son, kept detailed diary entries that were discovered hidden in her cell walls decades later. Her writings reveal the psychological complexity of asylum life, describing how patients would form alliances and betrayals based on their classification status, how information about staff preferences became valuable currency, and how the simple act of predicting whether a guard was having a good day could mean the difference between adequate food and deliberate starvation. Today I smiled at Attendant Bradley when he brought the morning medicine. She wrote, "Sarah warned me he prefers patients who appear grateful, not friendly. Was I too familiar? Mrs. Gordon was demoted to troublesome last week for addressing Dr. Pembridge by his first name. I must remember to keep my eyes down tomorrow and speak only when spoken to. The laundry supervisor has noticed my needlework skills. If I can be assigned to mending duties, I might earn enough privileges to receive my husband's letters." Mary's diary entries reveal how the classification system turned basic human interactions into calculated performances designed to manipulate the emotions of staff members who held absolute power over patients' lives. She describes studying the personalities and preferences of every doctor, nurse, attendant, and administrator, learning their individual triggers and rewards, and crafting different versions of herself to present to each person based on what she thought they wanted to see. But the most chilling aspect of her writings is how she gradually stopped thinking of herself as a person who was temporarily confined, and began thinking of herself as a permanent resident who needed to excel within the asylum's social structure. By her second year of confinement, her diary entries focused entirely on institutional politics and personal advancement within the patient hierarchy. She had stopped mentioning her husband, her home, or her life before the asylum. The institution hadn't just classified her body, it had reclassified her entire identity. The classification system's true purpose became clear when you looked at the asylum's financial records. Patients in higher categories generated more revenue through family payments, but they also required more resources in terms of individual attention, better food, and private accommodations. Patients in lower categories cost almost nothing to maintain, but generated steady income through government subsidies that were paid per patient, regardless of the quality of care provided. The financial incentive was to keep as many patients as possible in the lower categories, while maintaining just enough upper category patients to preserve the asylum's reputation with paying families. Doctors became experts at managing patient classifications to maximize profit while minimizing expense, promoting patients just often enough to maintain hope while ensuring that most remained in categories that required minimal investment. Dr. Robertson at the Royal Edinburgh Asylum perfected this balance through what he called therapeutic cycling, a system where patients would be periodically promoted and demoted through different classifications based not on their actual condition, but on bed availability and revenue requirements. A patient might spend 6 months as an improvable, then be suddenly reclassified as troublesome when the asylum needed to free up private room space, then promoted back to quiet status when their family threatened to stop payments. This cycling created a state of constant uncertainty that was psychologically devastating but administratively efficient. Patients never knew whether their current treatment level was permanent or temporary, whether their behavior was being evaluated or ignored, whether cooperation would be rewarded or taken for granted. They lived in a state of perpetual performance anxiety, always trying to demonstrate their worthiness for better treatment while never knowing what criteria were actually being used to judge them. The most tragic aspect of the classification system was how it destroyed patients' relationships with each other. In normal social situations, people facing common hardships tend to form bonds of mutual support and solidarity, but the asylum's hierarchy created competition where there should have been compassion, suspicion where there should have been trust, and isolation where there should have been community. Patients in higher categories learned to distance themselves from those in lower ones, afraid that association with undesirable elements might result in their own demotion. Those in lower categories developed resentment toward their better-treated peers, seeing them not as fellow sufferers, but as representatives of the system that oppressed them. The result was a community of deeply traumatized people who had been trained to see each other as threats rather than allies. But this story of systematic dehumanization through classification doesn't end with Victorian asylums. The next time you see homeless people being moved from one area to another based on their perceived impact on local business, remember Dr. Bucknell's categories. When you hear about patients being classified by insurance companies according to treatment costs rather than medical needs, think about the financial incentives that drove Victorian patient hierarchies. When you read about people being sorted into different levels of care based on their social value rather than their suffering, know that you're witnessing the direct descendants of Ward 7's classification system. We've gotten more sophisticated in our language, more subtle in our methods, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Society still needs ways to sort people into categories of worthy and unworthy, valuable and disposable, deserving and expendable. The Victorian Asylum just made this process more visible, more honest about its cruelty. Today's systems hide their classifications behind bureaucratic language and administrative procedures, but the sorting continues, and the consequences for those who find themselves in the wrong category remain just as devastating. You think Victorian society was prudish about sexuality, don't you? All those covered piano legs and fainting couches, those carefully chaperoned courtships and marriages arranged for social advantage rather than passion? But you're wrong. Behind the facade of moral righteousness, Victorian doctors had turned human sexuality into a laboratory for the most twisted experiments in social control ever conceived. What I'm about to show you will shatter every comfortable assumption you have about medical ethics and human decency. Let me take you to the basement levels of Colney Hatch Asylum in 1878, to rooms that don't appear on any official floor plans, where Dr. Isaac Baker Brown was conducting what he called moral surgery on female patients. The smell down here is different from the rest of the asylum. A mixture of carbolic acid and something else, something organic and wrong that clings to your throat like smoke from burning flesh. Brown had developed a theory that female hysteria, melancholia, and social deviance all stemmed from what he termed peripheral excitement of the female reproductive system. His solution was elegantly simple: remove the source of excitement through surgical intervention. What he was actually doing was performing mass genital mutilation on women whose only crime was being inconvenient to their families or society. The procedure was called clitoridectomy, and Brown had refined it into an assembly line operation that could process dozens of women in a single day. Patients would be strapped to tables in rooms designed like surgical theaters, but with viewing galleries where medical students, visiting doctors, and paying observers could watch the procedures. Yes, you heard that correctly. Victorian gentlemen would pay admission fees to watch doctors mutilate women's genitals, and this was considered legitimate medical education. Brown's case notes reveal the casual brutality of these operations. Patient exhibits signs of moral insanity, evidenced by reading of novels and resistance to marriage proposals. He wrote about Eleanor Hartwell, a 22-year-old woman whose family had committed her for refusing an arranged marriage. Surgical intervention successful. Patient now shows proper feminine compliance and has ceased all inappropriate literary interests. What the notes don't mention is that Eleanor screamed for 3 days after the surgery before her vocal cords gave out, or that she developed infections that left her incontinent for the rest of her life, or that she never spoke another word to any human being, spending her remaining 12 years in the asylum staring at walls with the empty expression of someone whose soul had been surgically removed along with her flesh. But Brown wasn't working alone. Dr. Thomas Clifford Allbutt at Leeds General Infirmary had developed what he called therapeutic castration for male patients who exhibited what Victorian medicine termed excessive masculine energy. This included men who masturbated, who showed interest in multiple women, who engaged in physical fights, or who demonstrated any form of sexual aggression toward their wives. The procedure involved complete removal of the testicles without anesthesia, based on Allbutt's theory that the pain of the operation was itself therapeutic, shocking the patient's system into proper moral alignment. Recovery rates were low, infection rates were astronomical, but success rates were perfect. Not one patient who survived the procedure ever again exhibited signs of excessive masculine energy. The truly horrifying aspect of these operations wasn't their cruelty, but their popularity. Families would request sexual surgery for relatives whose behavior embarrassed them. Husbands would have wives operated on for showing insufficient enthusiasm in the bedroom. Parents would authorize procedures on children who showed signs of premature sexual development. The Victorian Asylum had become a genital modification factory, and society couldn't get enough of its services. Dr. Robert Lawson Tate at the Birmingham and Midland Hospital for Women took these concepts even further, developing what he called prophylactic gynecology. His theory was that many forms of female madness could be prevented by performing hysterectomies on women before they developed symptoms. Young women entering puberty, new mothers showing signs of postpartum depression, and wives who had difficulty conceiving were all candidates for preventive removal of their reproductive organs. Tate's surgical records show over 3,000 hysterectomies performed on women between the ages of 14 and 45, most of them for pre-symptomatic moral pathology. The operations were performed in conditions that would horrify modern medical practitioners. No sterilization of instruments, no antibiotics, no proper anesthesia, and often with medical students practicing surgical techniques on unconscious patients. The mortality rate for Tate's procedures was nearly 40%, but this was considered acceptable because the women who died were spared a lifetime of potential moral corruption. Those who survived were left physically and emotionally devastated, unable to bear children, often suffering from chronic pain and infections, but they were no longer capable of the sexual behaviors that Victorian society found threatening. Meanwhile, Dr. Horatio Storer in Boston was pioneering what he called racial improvement surgery, based on his belief that certain ethnic groups were genetically predisposed to sexual deviance and mental instability. Irish, Italian, and Eastern European women in American asylums were subjected to forced sterilizations that Storer claimed would prevent them from passing their inferior traits to future generations. Storer's program was implemented in over 30 institutions across the United States, with procedures performed on women who had no mental illness beyond being foreign-born and poor. The operations were justified as therapeutic interventions to treat hereditary predisposition to moral insanity. But the real purpose was to reduce the birth rate among immigrant populations that American nativists considered racially undesirable. The surgical techniques used in these programs were deliberately crude and traumatic. Rather than using standard medical procedures, doctors would employ methods designed to cause maximum damage to reproductive organs while ensuring that the women survived long enough to be discharged from the asylum. Internal scarring from botched surgeries would cause lifelong pain and complications, serving as a permanent reminder of their punishment for the crime of ethnic undesirability. But sexual surgery was only one aspect of the Victorian Asylum's assault on human reproduction. Dr. Francis Galton, cousin of Charles Darwin and founder of the eugenics movement, had established breeding programs in British asylums designed to study the inheritance of mental illness across multiple generations. Galton's experiments involved carefully controlled mating between selected patients, with offspring monitored from birth through adulthood to track the development of psychiatric symptoms. Women who showed signs of intelligence or strong will were paired with men who had been broken by asylum treatment, producing children who would be raised in institutional settings and observed for signs of inherited madness. The breeding records from Galton's programs read like livestock management manuals. Female subject 23 shows excessive intellectual capacity, but responds well to dietary restrictions and isolation therapy. Notes from the Earlswood Asylum record, paired with male subject 7, who exhibits proper submissive behaviors following therapeutic castration. offspring to be separated at birth and raised under controlled conditions for longitudinal study. What these clinical notes don't capture is the human reality of forced breeding between people who were already traumatized by institutional abuse. Women would be held down while men who had been driven insane by their treatment were forced to rape them. The resulting pregnancies were monitored like scientific experiments, with no consideration for the emotional or physical well-being of the mothers. Children born from these breeding programs were treated as research subjects from the moment of birth. They were separated from their mothers immediately, raised in isolation wards, and subjected to systematic psychological evaluation designed to identify early signs of inherited mental illness. Any behavior that deviated from institutional norms was interpreted as evidence of genetic deficiency and treated accordingly. Dr. Alexander Graham Bell, better known for inventing the telephone, was deeply involved in asylum breeding programs as part of his research into hereditary deafness. His work at the American School for the Deaf included forced sterilizations and breeding restrictions designed to eliminate what he considered genetic defects from the population. Bell's private correspondence, preserved in the Library of Congress, reveals his belief that deaf people represented a threat to human genetic integrity and should be prevented from reproducing. His influence led to laws in 30 American states authorizing forced sterilization of deaf individuals, along with those classified as mentally ill, epileptic, or morally deficient. The sterilization programs Bell helped establish continued well into the 20th century, with over 65,000 Americans subjected to forced surgical procedures based on eugenic principles that originated in Victorian asylums. The last forced sterilization under these programs was performed in 1981, less than 45 years ago, on a woman whose only defect was having been born deaf. But perhaps the most sinister aspect of Victorian sexual medicine was how it transformed normal human desires into pathological conditions requiring medical intervention. Dr. Richard von Krafft-Ebing's influential work, Psychopathia Sexualis, cataloged hundreds of sexual behaviors as mental illnesses, creating a medical framework that justified intervention in the most intimate aspects of human experience. According to Krafft-Ebing's classifications, women who experienced sexual pleasure were suffering from nymphomania. Men who preferred the company of other men had contrary sexual instinct, and anyone who engaged in sexual activities for reasons other than procreation within marriage was exhibiting sexual psychopathy. These diagnoses became grounds for asylum commitment and medical treatment that often involved surgical modification of sexual organs. The case files from institutions following Krafft-Ebing's protocols show thousands of people committed for behaviors that we now consider normal expressions of human sexuality. Young women who masturbated were subjected to clitoridectomy. Men caught in homosexual relationships underwent castration. Married couples who engaged in oral sex were separated and treated for perverse inclinations. Doctor? John Harvey Kellogg, founder of the famous cereal company, operated a sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan, where he implemented extreme versions of sexual pathology treatment. His methods included mechanical restraints to prevent masturbation, acid applied to genital tissue to reduce sensitivity, and surgical procedures to make sexual activity painful and unpleasant. Kellogg's treatment programs were advertised as health resorts where wealthy families could send relatives for moral rehabilitation. What patients actually experienced were months of systematic sexual torture designed to eliminate any capacity for physical pleasure. The cornflakes he invented were part of a diet regimen intended to reduce sexual desire by eliminating foods that might stimulate the libido. The records from Kellogg's sanitarium show over 1,200 surgical procedures performed on patients' genitals between 1885 and 1910, along with thousands of chemical treatments designed to permanently reduce sexual function. His methods were copied by doctors across America and Europe, creating a network of institutions dedicated to the surgical elimination of human sexuality. But these programs weren't hidden from public view. They were celebrated as breakthroughs in moral medicine, advertised in medical journals and popular magazines as scientific solutions to social problems. Victorian society embraced sexual surgery with the same enthusiasm they showed for other technological innovations, seeing it as evidence of human progress and scientific advancement. The advertising materials for these treatments read like marketing brochures for modern cosmetic surgery. Restore your daughter's moral purity through proven surgical methods, promised ads for clitoridectomy procedures. Eliminate your son's excessive masculine energy with therapeutic castration, offered treatments for boys who showed signs of sexual development. Families would travel hundreds of miles to access these procedures, paying enormous fees for operations that would permanently damage their relatives' capacity for sexual pleasure or reproduction. They believed they were providing the best possible medical care, the most advanced treatments available from the most qualified doctors in the world. The truly devastating aspect of Victorian sexual medicine wasn't just its immediate physical damage, but how it poisoned society's understanding of human sexuality for generations. The medicalization of normal sexual behavior created shame and fear around activities that are fundamental to human happiness and connection. Even today, we carry the psychological residue of Victorian sexual pathology in our attitudes toward pleasure, desire, and physical intimacy. Every time someone feels ashamed of their natural sexual impulses, every time society treats sexual diversity as a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be accepted, we're seeing the continued influence of doctors who believed that human sexuality was a disease requiring surgical cure. The Victorian Asylum's assault on human reproduction and sexuality represents one of the darkest chapters in medical history, a systematic campaign to eliminate the most fundamental aspects of human experience in service of social control. And the most terrifying truth is that it worked. Generations of people learned to fear and suppress their natural desires, to see their bodies as sources of shame rather than pleasure, to accept that sexual happiness was less important than social conformity. But this story didn't end when the last Victorian asylum closed its doors. The next time you hear someone describe sexual diversity as a mental health issue, remember Dr. Kraft-Ebing's classifications. When you see legislation designed to control reproductive choices, think about Dr. Galton's breeding programs. When you encounter shame and fear around normal human sexuality, know that you're witnessing the direct descendants of Victorian moral surgery, still operating in the shadows of our supposedly enlightened modern world. You've been walking through this nightmare with me for hours now, haven't you? Thinking you've seen the depths of human cruelty, the bottom of the abyss that Victorian medicine carved out of human suffering. But you're wrong. What I've shown you so far were the documented horrors, the ones they recorded in medical journals and government reports because they were proud of their work. Now I'm going to show you what they tried to bury, the secrets they took to their graves, the bodies they made disappear when even Victorian society would have recoiled in horror. Let me take you to the morgue of Bethlehem Royal Hospital at 3 a.m. on a foggy November night in 1881. The gas lamps flicker against damp stone walls, casting shadows that seem to writhe like living things. Dr. Edmund Shepherd, the night superintendent, is working alone with efficiency that comes from years of practice. On the metal tables before him lie the bodies of 7 patients who died that day, but only 3 of them will appear in tomorrow's official death records. This is the reality behind Victorian asylum mortality rates. For every death that was officially recorded, documented, and reported to families, there were 2 or 3 others that simply vanished into the bureaucratic ether. Patients who died under circumstances that might raise uncomfortable questions, who had been subjected to experimental treatments that hadn't been approved by medical boards, who had suffered injuries that would be difficult to explain to grieving relatives. Shepherd's private journal, discovered hidden behind a false wall during renovations in 1923, reveals the systematic nature of this cover-up operation. He maintained meticulous records of what he called discretionary disposals, patients whose deaths required special handling to protect the institution's reputation and the careers of staff members involved in their treatment. The categories in his journal read like a catalog of institutional murder. Experimental complications were patients who died during unauthorized medical procedures. Restraint accidents were those who suffocated in straitjackets or died from injuries sustained during violent suppression by guards. Dietary adjustments were patients who had been starved to death as punishment for behavioral infractions. Chemical reactions were those who died from poisoning by medicines that were being tested without their knowledge or consent. But the largest category in Shepherd's records was simply labeled administrative convenience. These were patients who had become inconvenient to the asylum's operations, either because their families had stopped paying fees, because they had become too expensive to maintain due to medical complications, or because they possessed knowledge about institutional practices that could prove embarrassing if they were ever released. The disposal methods Shepherd developed were ingeniously simple. Bodies would be dissected in the asylum's anatomy theater with useful organs, harvested for medical research, and the remaining tissue ground up and mixed into the fertilizer used in the asylum's gardens. Patients literally became part of the landscape, their bodies nourishing the roses and vegetable plots that provided fresh flowers for the administrative offices and food for staff meals. Dr. Marcus Wickham at the Surrey County Asylum had refined this process even further, establishing what he called the Perpetual Research Program. Living patients who were considered unlikely to recover were used as subjects for terminal experiments, medical procedures designed to test the limits of human endurance while providing valuable scientific data about pain tolerance, organ function under extreme stress, and the progression of death from various causes. Wickham's research notes, written in a code that wasn't deciphered until the 1950s, describe experiments that would have been considered war crimes if they had been performed by enemy soldiers rather than British doctors. Patients were infected with various diseases to study progression and treatment options. They were subjected to increasingly powerful drugs to determine lethal dosages. They were exposed to extreme temperatures, radiation from newly discovered X-ray machines, and experimental surgical procedures that had no possibility of improving their condition. The genius of Wickham's program was that it solved multiple institutional problems simultaneously. The asylum received payment for housing these patients until their deaths, which could be extended for months or even years, depending on the research requirements. The medical community gained valuable scientific knowledge that would have been impossible to obtain through ethical means. And society was rid of people who had been deemed incurably insane and therefore of no value to Victorian civilization. Patient records show that over 300 people died in Wickham's experiments between 1875 and 1890, but none of these deaths appear in official asylum mortality statistics. Their families were told that their relatives had died peacefully from natural causes related to their mental illness, and the bodies were disposed of through the same grinding and fertilizing process used at other institutions. The scope of these disposal operations becomes clear when you examine cemetery records from towns surrounding major asylums. Despite housing thousands of patients over decades of operation, Victorian asylums show remarkably few burials in local graveyards. The official explanation was that most patients were claimed by their families for burial elsewhere, but financial records show that very few families had the resources to transport bodies over long distances, and many had lost contact with their institutionalized relatives entirely. Dr. Bartholomew Ross at the West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum developed what he called the economic mortality model, a system for managing patient deaths that maximized financial benefit to the institution while minimizing administrative complications. His approach involved careful timing of deaths to coincide with billing cycles so that families would pay for a full month of care even if their relative died on the first day. Ross would also coordinate deaths to take advantage of seasonal variations in government subsidies and medical school demand for anatomical specimens. Winter months, when medical schools were in session and government funding was highest, would see spikes in patient mortality that Ross attributed to seasonal illnesses, but which actually reflected deliberate timing of terminal experiments and discretionary eliminations. His financial records show that the West Riding Asylum generated nearly 40% of its revenue from sources other than patient care. Sales of organs and tissue to medical schools, sales of fertilizer made from processed human remains, and payments from pharmaceutical companies for testing experimental drugs on patients who were expected to die regardless of treatment outcomes. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Victorian asylum mortality management was the development of what Dr. Cornelius Blackwood at Hanwell Asylum called preventive euthanasia. This was a systematic program for identifying patients who were likely to become problems for the institution and eliminating them before they could cause administrative difficulties. Blackwood's selection criteria included patients who asked too many questions about their treatment, who maintained correspondence with people outside the asylum, who showed signs of recovering enough mental capacity to seek legal representation, or who had witnessed staff members engaged in activities that could prove embarrassing if reported to authorities. The elimination methods were designed to appear natural and medically justified. Patients would be diagnosed with sudden onset illnesses that required isolation from other inmates and visitors. They would be treated with medicines that would induce symptoms consistent with their supposed condition, while actually poisoning them slowly enough to avoid suspicion. Death certificates would list causes that were common enough among asylum patients to avoid triggering investigations. Blackwood's private correspondence with other asylum superintendents reveals that preventive euthanasia was practiced at institutions throughout Britain and America. They would share techniques for identifying problematic patients, methods for inducing untraceable deaths, and strategies for managing family inquiries about sudden deaths of relatives who had previously been reported as stable or improving. The letters also reveal a casual callousness that is breathtaking in its banality. The Irish woman in Ward 7 has been asking to see a priest, Blackwood wrote to Dr. Shepherd at Bethlehem. I've diagnosed consumption and expect resolution within the fortnight. Have you had success with the mercury-arsenic combination for similar situations? These weren't monsters cackling over their evil deeds. They were professionals discussing technical problems with the same tone they might use to debate the merits of different architectural designs or administrative procedures. They had convinced themselves that what they were doing was not only necessary but beneficial, protecting society from dangerous individuals while advancing medical knowledge through practical research. The patient records that survive from this period show clear patterns of suspicious deaths that went completely uninvestigated by authorities. Patients who had been stable for months would suddenly develop fatal illnesses within days of writing letters to family members or requesting visits from clergy. Those who complained about their treatment would be diagnosed with conditions that required isolation and intensive medical intervention that invariably resulted in death. Mary Catherine O'Brien, a 32-year-old woman committed to Colney Hatch for religious mania, spent 2 years writing detailed letters to her sister describing her treatment and the conditions she witnessed in the asylum. Her letters, preserved in family archives, provide a patient's perspective on the systematic elimination of inconvenient inmates. They call it the sleeping sickness, she wrote in her final letter, dated 3 days before her death. Patients who ask too many questions or write too many letters develop this condition where they become weaker each day until they cannot stay awake. Dr. Morrison says it is a new form of brain fever, but I've noticed it only affects those who cause trouble for the staff. I fear I may have asked too many questions about poor Ellen's disappearance. Mary's death certificate lists acute encephalitis as the cause of death, but the symptoms she described in her letters are consistent with gradual poisoning by compounds that were readily available in Victorian asylum dispensaries. Her sister's attempts to investigate the circumstances of her death were blocked by institutional that prohibited family access to medical records or staff interviews. The disposal networks developed by Victorian asylums extended far beyond individual institutions, creating what amounted to a shadow economy built on human remains and suffering. Dr. Reginald Pemberton, who served as a consulting physician to multiple asylums throughout England, coordinated the distribution of bodies and organs among medical schools, pharmaceutical companies, and research institutions. Pemberton's business records, discovered in a sealed vault during the demolition of his London office building, show transactions involving thousands of human specimens over a period of 30 years. Bodies were priced according to their research value, with younger patients commanding higher prices than elderly ones, and those who had died from rare conditions being sold at premium rates to medical schools seeking unusual teaching specimens. The records also reveal that some patients were kept alive, specifically to increase their value as research subjects. Those diagnosed with interesting conditions would be maintained on minimal care while their diseases progressed, with detailed observations recorded for eventual publication in medical journals. Only when their conditions had advanced to stages that would provide maximum educational value would they be allowed to die, with their bodies immediately processed for distribution to paying customers. But the most horrifying discovery in Pemberton's records was evidence of what he called specimen preparation. This involved deliberately infecting healthy patients with diseases that would make their eventual remains more valuable for research purposes. Patients would be exposed to tuberculosis, syphilis, cancer, and other conditions, then monitored as the diseases progressed through their systems. The preparation process could take months or years, during which patients would experience all the suffering associated with their artificially induced conditions while believing they were receiving treatment for their mental illness. Their families would be told that their relatives' physical decline was a secondary effect of their psychiatric condition, and that the asylum was doing everything possible to provide comfort during their final stages. This systematic conversion of living human beings into commodities for medical trade represents perhaps the most purely evil aspect of Victorian asylum operations. Patients weren't just being mistreated or neglected, they were being deliberately transformed into products for sale to the highest bidder, with their suffering and death serving as sources of institutional revenue. The scope of these operations becomes clear when you examine the financial records of major medical schools from the Victorian period. The University of Edinburgh, Harvard Medical School, and Johns Hopkins all show significant expenditures for anatomical specimens sourced from asylum networks, with payments that far exceeded the costs of maintaining living patients. This economic incentive created a feedback loop that encouraged asylums to maximize patient mortality while extending the dying process long enough to extract maximum research value. Patients became more valuable dead than alive, but only if their deaths could be timed and managed to serve institutional interests. The true scope of Victorian asylum mortality manipulation will never be fully known because the cover-up operations were so thorough, and the record-keeping was deliberately obscured. But conservative estimates based on surviving documents suggest that at least 25% of all patient deaths in British asylums between 1850 and 1900 were the result of deliberate intervention rather than natural causes. That means tens of thousands of people who were committed to asylums for minor behavioral issues or family convenience were systematically murdered by the institutions that were supposed to care for them. Their bodies were processed into fertilizer and research specimens, their deaths were covered up by falsified records and corrupted officials, and their stories were buried so deeply that we're only now beginning to uncover the truth. But this story of institutional murder and disposal doesn't end with Victorian asylums. The next time you hear about suspicious deaths in care facilities, remember Dr. Shepard's discretionary disposals. When you see news reports about missing patients or unexplained mortality rates in psychiatric hospitals, think about Dr. Wickham's perpetual research program. When you encounter resistance to investigations of institutional deaths, know that you're seeing the direct descendants of Victorian cover-up operations, still protecting the reputation of systems that treat human life as an expendable commodity. You think this is ancient history, don't you? Something that happened in a distant past, when medicine was primitive and society was cruel, when people didn't know better and couldn't do better. You've convinced yourself that we've evolved, that our modern institutions are built on principles of human dignity and scientific ethics that would make Victorian brutality impossible today. But you're wrong, catastrophically, dangerously wrong. What I'm about to show you will shatter that comfortable delusion forever. The Victorian asylum didn't disappear. It transformed. It put on a white coat and learned the language of human rights. It traded iron bars for chemical restraints and medieval torture for psychological manipulation. It replaced physical chains with pharmaceutical control and overt cruelty with subtle coercion. But at its core, it remained exactly what it had always been, a system for removing inconvenient people from society's view while extracting profit from their suffering. Let me show you how the transformation happened. In 1946, Dr. Walter Freeman was performing lobotomies with an ice pick inserted through patients' eye sockets, a procedure he had learned from studying Victorian surgical techniques. He called it the transorbital lobotomy, but it was essentially the same brain-destroying operation that Dr. Gottlieb Burckhardt had pioneered in Victorian asylums 60 years earlier. Freeman traveled across America in a van he called the lobotomobile, performing surgery in the parking lots of hospitals and psychiatric facilities. Turning the systematic destruction of human consciousness into a mobile medical service, he performed over 3,500 lobotomies, many on patients who had no say in the decision, including children as young as 4 years old. The procedures Freeman performed were identical in purpose and effect to the moral surgeries of Victorian asylums. They eliminated difficult behavior by destroying the brain centers responsible for personality, emotion, and independent thought. Patients became docile and manageable, but they also became empty shells of their former selves, living zombies who posed no threat to social order because they no longer possessed the cognitive capacity for resistance. Freeman's work was celebrated in medical journals and popular media as a breakthrough in modern psychiatric treatment. Time magazine featured him on its cover as a pioneering scientist who had found a cure for mental illness. What they were actually celebrating was the industrialization of Victorian brain mutilation, the transformation of institutional torture into respectable medical procedure. But Freeman was just one manifestation of a much larger system that had learned to disguise its Victorian origins behind the language of scientific progress. Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal was conducting what he called psychic driving, a technique that combined sensory deprivation, drug-induced comas, and continuous audio loops designed to completely erase patients' existing personalities and rebuild them from scratch. Cameron's methods were directly descended from Dr. Wilhelm Griesinger's moral reconstruction programs, using the same principles of personality destruction and rebuilding that had been perfected in Victorian asylums. The only difference was the sophistication of the technology. Instead of physical isolation and verbal indoctrination, Cameron used LSD, electroshock therapy, and recorded messages played at volumes and frequencies that could penetrate drug-induced unconsciousness. His patients, mostly women suffering from depression or anxiety, would be kept in medically induced comas for weeks or months, while their brains were systematically reorganized according to Cameron's vision of proper mental health. When they finally regained consciousness, they would have no memory of their previous lives, no recognition of family members, no sense of personal identity beyond what had been programmed into them during their unconscious state. Cameron's work was funded by the CIA as part of their MKUltra program, but it was also supported by the Canadian government, prestigious medical institutions, and respected psychiatric organizations. The same social establishment that had celebrated Victorian asylum innovations was now endorsing their modern equivalents, proving that the underlying attitudes toward inconvenient people had never really changed. The pharmaceutical revolution of the 1950s provided new tools for achieving Victorian goals without Victorian publicity. Thorazine, the first major psychiatric medication, was marketed as a humane alternative to physical restraints and surgical interventions, but its actual effect was to chemically reproduce the compliance that Victorian doctors had achieved through mechanical constraint and surgical mutilation. Patients on high doses of Thorazine developed what psychiatrists called chemical lobotomy, a condition virtually identical to the results of Freeman's surgical procedures. They became emotionally flat, cognitively impaired, and physically sluggish, but they were no longer disruptive to institutional routines or family dynamics. The drug had achieved the same social control goals as Victorian surgical intervention, but with the added benefit of being reversible if public attention became uncomfortable. Dr. Nathan Klein, who pioneered the use of psychiatric medications in American hospitals, explicitly described his work as a continuation of Victorian psychiatric traditions. His private papers, donated to the National Library of Medicine, include detailed studies of Victorian asylum techniques and their potential for modernization through pharmaceutical intervention. Klein's approach to psychiatric medication was based on the same classification systems that had been used in Victorian asylum, with different drugs prescribed not according to patients' medical needs, but according to their social category and institutional value. Wealthy patients received newer, safer medications with fewer side effects, while poor patients were given whatever drugs were cheapest or most effective at maintaining behavioral control. The result was a two-tier system that perfectly reproduced Victorian asylum hierarchies. Privileged patients received treatment that might actually improve their condition, while expendable patients received chemical restraints designed to eliminate problematic behaviors regardless of the cost to their physical and mental health. This pharmaceutical approach to social control expanded far beyond psychiatric hospitals, infiltrating schools, prisons, nursing homes, and even family structures. Children who showed signs of creativity or independence were diagnosed with attention disorders and medicated into compliance. Elderly people who complained about their treatment were prescribed drugs that would reduce their capacity for coherent protest. Prisoners who organized resistance to institutional abuse were treated with medications that would eliminate their ability to think clearly or communicate effectively. The genius of pharmaceutical control was that it could be presented as medical treatment rather than social engineering. Families could tell themselves they were providing health care for difficult relatives rather than having them chemically lobotomized. Institutions could claim they were treating mental illness rather than eliminating inconvenient behaviors. Society could maintain its self-image as humane and progressive while continuing to dispose of problematic people through chemical rather than surgical means. But perhaps the most insidious evolution of Victorian asylum principles has been their integration into what we now call the mental health system. Modern psychiatric hospitals, residential treatment facilities, and community mental health programs all operate according to principles that would be instantly recognizable to Victorian asylum superintendents. The classification systems are still there, hidden behind diagnostic manuals and treatment protocols. Patients are still sorted into categories of worthy and unworthy, deserving and expendable, profitable and disposable. The treatments are still designed primarily to eliminate socially inconvenient behaviors, rather than address underlying causes of distress. The economic incentives still favor keeping people dependent on institutional services rather than helping them achieve genuine independence. Dr. Thomas Szasz, one of the few modern psychiatrists willing to acknowledge these connections, spent his career documenting how contemporary mental health systems continued Victorian traditions of social control disguised as medical treatment. His analysis of psychiatric hospitalization showed that the same patterns of abuse, exploitation, and systematic dehumanization that characterized Victorian asylums were still operating in modern facilities, just with better public relations and more sophisticated justifications. Szasz's research revealed that modern psychiatric hospitals showed the same suspicious mortality rates that had characterized Victorian asylums, the same patterns of patient disappearance and administrative cover-up, the same economic structures that made suffering more profitable than healing. But when he tried to publish these findings, he faced the same institutional resistance that had protected Victorian asylum superintendents from criticism. The pharmaceutical industry has become the modern equivalent of Victorian asylum networks, generating enormous profits from human suffering while maintaining a facade of scientific respectability and humanitarian concern. The same economic incentives that drove Victorian doctors to maximize patient dependency and extend institutional stays now drive modern mental health systems to create lifelong medication dependencies and chronic treatment relationships. Dr. Marcia Angel, former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, has documented how pharmaceutical companies systematically suppress research, showing that their psychiatric medications often cause more harm than benefit, particularly when used long-term. Her analysis reveals that modern psychiatric treatment often follows the same pattern as Victorian asylum care: initial interventions that create dependency and deterioration, followed by increasingly intensive treatments that generate maximum revenue while providing minimal actual benefit. The classification of normal human responses to trauma, loss, and social stress as mental illnesses requiring pharmaceutical intervention directly parallels Victorian practices of medicalizing social deviance and emotional expression. Children who react to abuse with anger are diagnosed with behavioral disorders. Women who respond to domestic violence with depression are treated as if their brain chemistry, rather than their circumstances, were the problem. Men who develop anxiety after losing their jobs are medicated rather than help to address the economic factors causing their distress. But the most chilling parallel between Victorian asylums and modern mental health systems is the continued use of human beings as experimental subjects without genuine informed consent. The pharmaceutical industry conducts drug trials on psychiatric patients using the same justifications that Victorian doctors used for their experimental procedures. The patients are already suffering, the treatments might help them, and the knowledge gained will benefit society. These modern experiments follow the same patterns as Victorian research programs. Vulnerable populations are targeted for studies that carry significant risks. The true nature of the treatments is concealed from participants, and the economic interests of researchers take precedence over patient welfare. The only difference is that contemporary experimental subjects sign consent forms that they often lack the capacity to understand due to their psychiatric conditions or the effects of medications they're already taking. The facilities where these experiments take place maintain the same architectural and social structures as Victorian asylums: isolated locations that limit family contact, hierarchical staffing systems that discourage questioning of treatment decisions, and administrative procedures that make it difficult for patients to access legal representation or advocate for their rights. Dr. Peter Breggin, a psychiatrist who has spent decades documenting abuses in modern mental health systems, describes contemporary psychiatric hospitals as med-ed facilities, where patients are primarily valued for their research potential and revenue generation rather than their individual welfare. His investigations have revealed ongoing patterns of coercive treatment, experimental procedures disguised as standard care, and systematic violation of patients' basic human rights. The COVID pandemic provided a particularly clear view of how easily modern institutions can revert to Victorian-era practices when public attention is focused elsewhere. Reports emerged from psychiatric facilities, nursing homes, and other care institutions of patients being isolated for months without family contact, subjected to experimental treatments without consent, and dying under circumstances that received minimal investigation. The justifications for these practices were identical to those used by Victorian asylum superintendents: public safety, medical necessity, institutional efficiency. The results were also identical. Vulnerable people suffered and died, while institutions protected their reputations and financial interests. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this continuity is how completely it has been normalized and accepted by contemporary society. We've learned to see pharmaceutical control as humane treatment, involuntary commitment as medical intervention, and systematic violation of human rights as therapeutic necessity. Every time you see someone whose behavior has been chemically modified to make them more socially acceptable, you're witnessing the direct continuation of Victorian asylum practices. Every time you encounter resistance to investigating suspicious deaths in care facilities, you're seeing the same institutional protection systems that covered up murders in Victorian hospitals. Every time you hear someone dismiss concerns about psychiatric treatment as anti-medical prejudice, you're hearing the same arguments that protected Victorian doctors from accountability for their crimes. The Victorian asylum never ended. It just learned to hide better, to speak more softly, to kill more slowly and with less obvious violence. It traded its iron bars for chemical chains, its straitjackets for pharmaceutical restraints, its surgical theaters for research protocols, but at its core, it remained exactly what it had always been: a system for disposing of inconvenient people while extracting profit from their destruction. And the most terrifying truth of all is that we've not only accepted this system, we've celebrated it as progress. We've convinced ourselves that chemical lobotomy is more humane than surgical lobotomy, that pharmaceutical dependency is better than physical restraint, that modern experimental abuse is more ethical than Victorian experimental abuse, but the patients strapped to beds in contemporary psychiatric hospitals are just as helpless as those chained to walls in Victorian asylums. The families who sign commitment papers for difficult relatives are making the same choice as Victorian parents who paid to have their children disappeared. The society that tolerates systematic abuse of vulnerable people in the name of medical treatment is the same society that bought tickets to watch the inmates of Bedlam perform their madness for public entertainment. We are the Victorians. We always have been. We've just gotten better at lying to ourselves about what we're doing and why we're doing it. The asylum walls may be painted in cheerful colors now, and the staff may wear scrubs instead of formal coats, but the screams are still there if you know how to listen. They echo through every modern institution that promises to fix what society deems broken about the human condition, and they will continue echoing until we finally find the courage to acknowledge what we've become.